So I'd like to bring up Gina Czarnecki and Professor John Hunt to speak about the Heirloom project and its next steps and development. Heirloom grows living portraits of artist Gina Czarnecki's daughters from their own cells that have been cultured from a single sample taken from their mouths in 2014. They grow on delicate glass casts of their faces in the life support system that provides the best conditions for growth outside the lab. Heirloom is co-authored between Gina and Professor John Hunt and has been exhibited internationally since its completion in May 2016. Gina and John aim to develop Heirloom to grow layers of cells and anatomically accurate structures to fit perfectly the shape of a subject's face. For Heirloom, they conduct this work in a public space to present the ongoing work live for it to be viewed as both science and art, with an aim to raise ethical questions. An accessible or visible space is ideal as it presents aspects for future research in regenerative therapies to the public directly, and for these concepts and approaches relating to cell therapies and stem cell issues to be known, considered and discussed. Gina studied painting and film at Wimbledon School of Art and is a postgraduate degree holder from the Duncan of Johnstone College of Art and Design, Dundee. Through a varied practice of video installation, drawing, sculpture and unconventional range of media, her work engages people with the visceral, psychological and biological grey areas, hybrids and developments that provoke questions on many levels. Professor John Hunt is the lead for medical technologies and advanced material at Nottingham Trent University. John's research focuses on developing breakthrough therapies, devices and technology to repair, replace, augment and in the future regenerate disease and damaged tissues in humans using material interventions. His research has been funded by the European Commission, EPSRC and industry bodies. I'll hand over now to Gina and John.
I think we started working on Heirloom in 2014 together. I'd met John through his work with the Skin to Faces exhibition at FACT, which was looking at developments in art which use the new materiality of, or the new plasticity of the possibility of moulding, manipulating the human body in tissue and cells. And John, well, you can say what you were with.
So at the time, Liverpool had the UK Centre for Tissue Engineering, and part of the European Capital of Culture event was to have this Skin to Faces exhibition at FACT. And it seemed at the time that the whole of the bioart world suddenly needed tissue culture facilities and wanted to come into the UK centre, because we had one in Liverpool and it was right there within a mile of FACT, to come and grow their stuff, which would then go into FACT, and most of it alive. So that was a very engaging proposition for us, to be able to take a living experiment for me out into the public space and make it safe in that public space, but still have it alive. So it's one thing to try and grow something in the lab and have it safe, reproducible. It's another thing to take it out where the public can poke it and mess about with it, and it still be safe and it still be alive. So it was fascinating. It was absolutely fascinating. And from that, I would say I was hooked, really. Yeah.
So we started working on Heirloom, which originally was just to try and grow skins on a three-dimensional structure, so you had living tissue in a portrait, to look at contemporary portraiture through, the history within art, identity, portraiture, and so on. And like a lot of my works, it starts simply, and then you realise how complex it actually is. So John and I talked about the possibilities of this, and if we start the slides now, it's we took casts of my daughter's faces when they were 11 and 13. They're now 17 and 15, right? So 4 years ago exactly. And what you see here is kind of the glass cases, the glass faces of the daughters we used as a scaffold to grow their own stem cells on. And these, normally stem cells are grown from a skin plug, which is dermis and epidermis.
That looks better.
You see what I mean by the little faces in the corner. Dermis and epidermis, but John managed to grow them from what we first tried were eyelash and eyebrow follicles, and then buccal swabs from the skin. And they went into the lab to, I suppose, take these and nurture them with you.
Yeah, I mean, we'll bounce backwards and forwards between the art and the science here, and you can decide where they overlap and where the blur is. So, in future medicine, much is made of cellular therapies, and it's all in the headlines now that we're not just going to make you well with antibiotics, and we're not just going to repair you, we're going to regenerate you. We're going to regenerate you with your own cells. So how hard is that? So here was an opportunity to say, okay, you can rack up to the lab, and we can take a sample from you, from which we can expand those cells. So you start to explore and develop what's scientifically possible here. How far is this sci-fi and how real is this sci-reality? What can we do? How hard is it? What's involved? Do you want it? And we were really taking minimally invasive techniques. So you can do this. You might have done it in my day, GCSE. You might have taken your fingernail, scraped the inside of your cheek, stuck it on a slide, and there you go. You've got some cells. And that might be the first cells that you've ever seen when you were at school. That and an onion skin, I'll grant you that. But those are the things that you might have seen. And from that quite simply is enough. And we wanted to take that forward. The hair follicle idea was that there are, scientifically of interest to me, that the hair follicle is a so-called stem cell niche. So there is a population of the magic cells for the future in that hair follicle. So if you pluck an eyebrow, you do have a small population of the required cells to, in theory, develop into any other tissue in the body.
So what my fascination was of course the materiality of it, and people like lay people's or artists' access to that kind of work. So part of the drive was how do you make it possible to then grow these stem cells outside of a laboratory scenario on like ubiquitous equipment that anybody can get their hands on. So tropical fish tank materials and equipments, basically just two glass we call bioreactors with a drainage so the surface stays flat and cells are drained from the bottom. Grown on glass because it's neutral and it won't affect the cell structure at all. And the idea was then to lift them off so we could get this thin, like, I don't know if you keep snakes, anybody's snake skin-like structure, 3D form. Ideally, what you see behind you is the exhibition of the final thing, where it wasn't just about the finished artifacts of the skin, it was really about the process of making it, because intrinsic to all of this is my daughter's consent in the process and their participation in the process. You realise I said they were 11 and 13, not 17 and 15. They've changed their minds a bit. But they were quite involved with this and had their faces cast again 2 years later. And part of the thinking originally was this, that if we're in a situation where there's 19-year-olds getting Botox in Liverpool and people are taking cosmetic procedures far more easily than they would have done 10, 20 years ago, then what's the future of personalised medicine, but also where the kind of cosmetic modification can perhaps enable you to have the skin you had back when you were 15 or 20. And the structure of the face is all part of that as well. And that's where Face Lab and Caroline comes in, because we then thought, rather than just taking my daughter's faces through old and ancient technologies like plaster casting and glass melting, then what if we 3D scan that? And Face Lab have a scientifically accurate scanner whereby you can reconstruct people's faces, and you'll see behind some of the faces that we've scanned. So the exhibition then scanned the participants' faces, and they allowed that to happen. If you get the DNA through a skin sample of a person and their facial image in a scientifically accurate way, you can technically or theoretically make clones, or the appearance of someone with the same DNA.
Identicals.
Identicals.
Do you want an identical? So the scenario would play out here that at some stage in your life you may not be well. It may involve some kind of physical trauma. It may involve some kind of tumour excision or something, if that's facial, then there will be some facial reconstruction required, and here's an opportunity to either return back to the face you had on that day, or go back even further to your 3D scanned records of your previous earlier self. Which part of your life would you like to go back to, presented with that opportunity? Which face would you like to have, were that to be required? If you had a catalogue to choose from, rather than going back through your own data sets, it presents all kinds of possibilities, and then the questions of, should you be provided with that option? Should we do that? Cloning is illegal, so we're not trying
in
to
the
clone.
UK.
Cloning a whole human person is still illegal everywhere. So yes, cloning's not illegal if it's not a human being, but cloning humans is illegal, and we still consider that nobody on the planet is doing that. But we don't know everything about what's happening on the planet. But this, of interest again in current emerging technologies, this is a three-dimensional structure that we want to grow, we want to tissue engineer. So currently, scientifically, for skin replacement, we grow a two-dimensional flat surface. It might have depth, but it's two-dimensional and flat. And I could challenge any of you to take a piece of tissue, piece of toilet roll tissue, and try and form that onto a part of your body without tearing it or creasing it or folding it, creating imperfections, crease lines and tears. Here's an opportunity to grow the facial form in that 3 dimensions, and that's very, very tempting. And you would combine that with the 3-dimensional scanning. You would then combine it with the latest, greatest thing that we've all got to have in our own homes, a 3D printer. You could 3D print the face in the right kind of material that would degrade at the right kind of rate, such that when we were doing it in Copenhagen and the first time, instead of lifting the face and those layers of skin, you just allow the substrate to degrade, and you're left with that face, with that skin in perfect form. You might introduce that with the scaffold, albeit very thin, onto the face during surgery, allow that to form the adhesion, and then allow that to degrade, and you would be left with the skin cells on the patient's face.
The patient's own skin cells on the patient's own face, taken from a scan of the other side of their face, or their face reconstructed in 3D. But all this could happen in 2 weeks. The skin cells could grow within 2 weeks, and the laser, obviously scanning and laser technology is pretty much instant, and the 3D scan will be available on your smartphone pretty soon. We were interested then in how that you potentially apply that for medical benefit. And if you imagine, I think the example I use a lot is children with facial burns, like mainly due to kettle burns, which don't go away, and how you could then graft or grow skin in 3 dimension that still has its elasticity because you haven't stretched the cells or the tissues to form it. Because it's grown with the patient's own skin cells, ethically it's far more ethically it's beneficial. I'll go into that later, but skin plasters are mainly grown from donations from the rabbi. Like, you can join the dots there, but they're grown from foreskins, donated foreskins. And you get a big skin plaster the size of a football field, but it's grown in 2 dimensions, so it has to stretch. That's true, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Sometimes I say things that are scientific and the fact seems so weird that nobody would believe me, but
So we sort of, with this idea, would then also stray into, because 3D scans are so readily available now, why would you not just take a scan regularly? Why would you not have a 3D scan? Why would you not have a whole body 3D scan, so that were it to be required for tissue reconstruction, we have a map, we have that 3D information. Why would you not do that? Data's cheap now, you can get lots of storage. We're all talking about big data. The question then is, how often Do I need to have that scan? If I'm going off to do, you know, big air snowboarding at the Winter Olympics, and there's a good chance I'm going to smash myself to bits, I'll get a whole body scan before I go, because you guys will put me back together after I've smashed myself to bits, and I'll be more or less back to the way I was previously. So there are opportunities there in the high impact trauma, sports injuries, all the high risk places where people might go, as well as the increase in tumours and cancers and the need to take them out, and the space that is created by taking them out is required to be filled. So we've got a nice mixture of the future health demands of our ageing population. We will live longer, but chances are during that longer life we will have smashed ourselves to bits multiple times, or we'll have worn ourselves out. So there are two quite dark scenarios in the thing that actually we might live to, what was it? 15 million of us currently might live to be over 100 on the planet this time around, and currently it's not that many, so it's quite startling, that fact.
Apparently they only know parrots die at 72 because they'll get depressed, because the only ones they measure are trapped in cages. So I think it might be similar, we'll all die. But the other scenario is also, with 2 minutes of video footage, you can reconstruct a three-dimensional portrait of someone. So, I don't know, Brad Pitt. Nobody owns those images, they're on television, right? You don't have to reconstruct your own face, you can actually build it from combinations of other people. There's all these scenarios which are in question, and if we as an artwork then ask for people's DNA as well as like a buccal swab, it's simple, or pick up a cigarette from the floor like one artist did in terms of reconstructing people through their DNA, then who owns that material and what permissions have we got to do what with it? And I'm really interested in the grey areas between spaces, the things that aren't yet barcoded, or how new technologies shape and inform culture or shaped and informed by culture. And I'm interested in the hybridity between the kind of exploration that's beneficial potentially to medical practice, but also beneficial to a new materiality that can be used and owned by artists without being locked up for strange experiments like Steve Kurtz was by keeping agar jars in his room at home.
Yeah, so we stray now into identity and who owns identity. Which part of your identity do you own? Which part of your identity do you feel you own? If you put something out, if you put a picture of yourself out on the social media world, that's not yours anymore. You've just shared that, that's everybody's. So did Brad Pitt lose his personal ownership of his face and that part of his identity by putting himself out there socially, by putting his image out there in the world? So as we walk down the street, are we constantly now, thanks to CCTV, losing our identity, losing our right to our privacy, as well as our identity? How we address those questions? Can we, and we might in May, and this will be interesting how this plays out, we have the right to disappear. We will have the right to disappear, thanks to the change in personal information and the regulation of personal information. Exactly how that's going to work, I don't think we've really worked out in full, but you will have the right to disappear. That'll be fascinating.
Are we at about time? Oh, good. The exhibition actually opens tomorrow in...
Around again? Oh, sorry.
We'll just put it round again. The exhibition actually opens tomorrow in the Rijksmuseum, and every time we've shown this work, it's been on continual show since May 2016. In a context called Trust Me, I'm an Artist is where I started out, which was about ethical questions between arts and sciences and the spaces between that. But every time we've shown it, it's had particular context which has raised ethical questions that has always been a continual debate. For example, the one at the Rijksmuseum, we've had long discussions about whether it should be included in a 200-year celebration of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and what my kids might think of that. And So it's going to great lengths to discuss context, what's shown, how it's shown, what it's shown next to try and protect the subjects of this. But the subjects then could be anybody. They don't need to be the daughters anymore. We could release them from that burden, because when it was shown in Liverpool, their attitude towards the whole thing changed. I think Caroline and I went round crossing their names out on the name cards because they said, we don't mind, we just don't want to be named. But they did mind when their friends started tweeting images of them in this back to them, and then they got really self-conscious, and suddenly the word child abuse came up, which is, you know, it's kind of something interesting to look at. But the whole process was made and called Heirloom about what you leave of value to the next generation. And in this very direct sense, this was about the daughters and the way that the two tubes are linked into one. I mean, we get all symbolic here, like the shoelaces reaching out to Theo with Van Gogh's book. It sounds awful, but it's kind of representing a woman. At the time that they were given their cells in John's lab, I was also having a hysterectomy. So the whole thing became phenomenally personal about value, love, care, nurturing, as well as the context of art and biomedicine. So we kind of talk about it quite cold, but it's actually a very, very deeply personal piece. And also then taking that experimentation out into a public space for you was also an opportunity that you wouldn't normally have had.
So, and the reason why I paused it on here is these are the bioreactor chambers on which we would grow the cells. There's a pump very much like your heart to pump the tissue culture fluid round. There are two heaters and stirrers to maintain the fluid at 37 degrees body temperature. And then the system's closed. So this is a closed tissue culture system. And this was a fantastic opportunity, as I mentioned before, to take something like that out into the public space and say, demystify it and say, this is you know, how you grow stem cells. This is what they would become. But it was also an opportunity to do a living experiment where I wasn't scientifically interrogating the outcome. So N, the magic N, for statistical analysis and having a decent repeat, a number of repetitions of that experiment to make that the data that you find real and true. Suddenly N was 1. And it didn't matter that it wasn't reproducible. What mattered was that you got a result. You were able to grow something on those faces that could be lifted off. And that was a dramatic difference. That was a dramatic change to the scientific experimentation. Not only could you demonstrate what was scientifically possible, suddenly you just had to do the one experiment. And then from that, do another one experiment. And enjoy the journey of, okay, the first time we did it in Copenhagen, we really wanted it to work. So we hit it with absolutely every stem cell supercharger cocktail. We made up our own, and it grew too fast. It grew in a form. It completed its growth and journey in 2 weeks.
And it clogged up the system and leaked in an 11th century building.
So we were quite unpopular. But it was a fantastic result. But that also did mean that we had to clear it all out and restart it. Anyone that's even dipped their toe into the water of stem cell research knows that this costs an absolute fortune. Even before the capacity of your system is 12 litres, this costs an absolute fortune. So that miscalculation was, oh my God, this is going to be expensive, right? Okay, let's detune the formula. So we could then have the luxury of, right, we don't have to have it that nutritionally rich. We can start to starve these cells. We can make it last longer. We might even be able to time it. And then the time we came across back to Liverpool into FACT, we went to the other extreme and really created an environment where it was going to be very, very, very slow growth. Over the whole process, 3 months of the exhibition, so we could learn to time it to the exhibition requirements. And also the problem was that once it gets thick with stem cells, the liquid becomes so dense that you actually can't see the glass in them. So it became not only a balance with how fast the cells grow, but actually the aesthetic presence of the faces was so strong that just seeing bowls of red soup didn't have the same impact. did for me, but anyway.
Not for me.
No, and not for most of the visitors that came along because they couldn't see the faces.
But the expense obviously is going to mean certain people can and certain people can't do these kind of experiments at home or otherwise. Yet there is such a thing called out-of-date stock, which can't be used medically, can't be used for scientific research.
It's not reproducible.
Not reproducible. And there's a potential there that people like me wanting to work in this area could become a centre for the a centre for the acceptance of out-of-date media food for cells. That's a good title, isn't it?
Yeah, but again, to use the badge of the stem cell research area, it's a high value to the suppliers of that research area. So many years ago, I took on a student to re-engineer most of those medias because I was not prepared to pay those prices, and start to reinvent those culture medias because we might not need everything that's in them. And you can really start to bring the price down. You haven't spent the time developing that, and it's not what the market is worth. It's what's the cost of the raw ingredients and what's absolutely required in that media. And if you can break it down like that, then the costs do start to come within reach.
Mm.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.